We are going to talk about the 2 years of the Taliban's takeover of Kabul or Afghanistan. And we are joined here to talk about this very important issue by Heather Barr, who is the Associate Director of Women's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch.
Some of the broad categories of rights they've taken away from women and girls, first of all, of course, is education. They banned secondary education for girls almost immediately. They banned university education, higher education in December of last year.
Can you also speak to us about the economic side of this, and why is it that the targeting of women is also targeting of families and households?
First of all, pushing women out of jobs, which has driven women and women-headed households deeper into poverty, and then blocking aid agencies from being able to reach those women by saying that women can't be aid workers.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to New Wave Global. I'm Rabia Mahmood. What are we going to talk about? We are going to talk about the 2 years of the Taliban's takeover of Kabul or Afghanistan, 2 years of a very brutal regime in the country, and especially 2 years of this brutality in the wake of 20 years of war, and which was again followed by another Taliban rule, as we know. And we are joined here to talk about this very important issue by Heather Barr, who is the Associate Director of Women's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch. Heather is also an expert on Afghanistan because she's been working on the country for longer than she has been at the Human Rights Watch, if I'm not wrong. Heather, thank you for joining us. Can you just speak to us about and walk us through as to why the United Nations Special Procedures have recently called what's been happening in Afghanistan, especially the treatment of women, girls, and ethnic and religious minorities on the hands of the Taliban regime, gender apartheid or a gender persecution? Or why is it that they have said that it could be categorized as a crime against humanity, or crimes against humanity for that matter? Can you please briefly walk us through as to why the Taliban are and the regime is so horrifying for the people of the country?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. I mean, you know very well that the Taliban, the Taliban in the last 2 years have been steadily rolling back women's rights of women and girls. There seems to be new bad news almost every day about new restrictions they're imposing. So we can't list all of the rules they've imposed because it would take all day, but just to mention some of the broad categories of rights they've taken away from women and girls. First of all, of course, is education. They banned secondary education for girls almost immediately. They banned university education, higher education in December of last year. And recently there have been reports that in some provinces, they're even saying that girls over the age of 10 should not be attending primary school. So of course, education is so key to so many other rights that we have in our lives. And if you take that away, then it's very hard for people to have other rights as well. Speaking of other rights, another one that's been a huge issue is employment. The Taliban banned women from working in government and civil service roles almost immediately in most jobs. And then they've banned women from working for international NGOs. They extended that ban to women working for the United Nations this spring. And something really worrying happened about a month and a half ago, which is they issued a new order banning beauty salons. And this might not be obvious why this is such a big deal, but it really is for a couple reasons. First of all, 60,000 women lost their jobs when the beauty salons closed, and many of those women probably will have been, the sole wage earner for their families. Second of all, one of the first things the Taliban did was they dismantled the whole system that had been put in place to deal with domestic violence. So all the shelters, the legal services, counseling services, specialized prosecution units, specialized courts, the law itself, the 2009 law on elimination of violence against women, all of that pretty much disappeared overnight. And in that context, the beauty salons were actually one of the only spaces where women could go outside of their home have a sense of community, support each other, give each other advice, help, sisters who are in trouble. So they've taken that away now too. And then the last reason that the beauty salon closure is so worrying is because up until then, the private sector seemed to be the one area where they were willing to let women work. And this is the first time that they've pushed women out of a part of the private sector. And it really raises the concern that perhaps their end goal is women not being allowed to work outside the home at all. And perhaps girls not being able to study at all either. I've already talked a lot, but just to say very quickly, some other rights that have disappeared are freedom of movement, serious restrictions on women being able to move around without a mahram, and speech, of course. We've seen the Taliban beating and arresting and torturing women who've protested against their policies.
And disappearing them.
And disappearing them, exactly.
You're mentioning the beauty salons, and you've sort of course, explained it quite well, that these were the women-only spaces where women were working with women and providing a service to women. And they're not allowed to work otherwise in spaces where they intermingle with men. But this is not just about women, right? It's about households and families, considering that there is a humanitarian crisis and a big sort of issue with the economy in the country as well. Can you sort of also sort of speak to us about the economic side of this, and why is it that the targeting of women is also targeting of families and households?
Absolutely. So, yeah, as you've said, there's a huge humanitarian crisis going on in Afghanistan. And that crisis was triggered initially by international donors pulling their aid to Afghanistan after the Taliban took over. But at this point, the crisis has been worsened severely by the Taliban, first of all, pushing women out of jobs, which has driven women and women-headed households deeper into poverty, and then blocking aid agencies from being able to reach those women by saying that women can't be aid workers. And we know from research everywhere in the world that in a humanitarian crisis, women and girls suffer the most. They go without food first. They're the last to eat, and so on. But particularly in a culture where there's as much gender segregation as there is in Afghanistan, it's really not possible for women-headed households, for example, to receive food from male aid workers or to go and line up with men to collect food. And so removing the women aid workers from the equation really means that you're gonna worsen that disparity, and more women and women-headed households are going to go hungry. And the statistics show that. There's data from the United Nations that shows that rates of malnutrition are significantly worse among households headed by women.
On this very grim note, we'll go to our next question. How can the Taliban be held accountable for what they are doing? They're doing it on the world's watch. And the rest of the world, including the Middle East or the countries in South Asia, including Pakistan, and the United States and otherwise, these countries are engaging with the Taliban, and the mechanisms are in place, but as much as they want to be recognized as a legitimate government, the Islamic Emirate, they are thrashing or just like trampling all over their own people.
Yeah, so the international response to this situation has been really poor. It's interesting because there's been, pretty much a 100% consensus that what the Taliban is doing is wrong, that it's wrong to deny girls education. It's wrong to deny women access to employment. There's no country in the world that's defending those practices. And yet still that doesn't seem to add up to an effective response. There hasn't really been that much pressure on the Taliban. The Taliban seem to, just ignore everything that everyone says to them about women's rights and carry on. And they seem to be getting what they want anyway. They're gradually, sort of becoming normalized, seeming more and more like they're being accepted as legitimate leaders of the country. And this is really incredibly frustrating for women's rights defenders who are trying to push back against this kind of creeping normalization. And so, part of what I think activists are looking for is is real accountability, including in the form of prosecution. They want to see Taliban leaders being charged with crimes and having arrest warrants issued for them. And we know that the International Criminal Court has been looking into the situation in Afghanistan, not specifically about the Taliban, but the human rights situation generally since 2006. So that's a very, very long wait. But in the last year or so, they've gotten permission to move ahead with their investigation. And there are hopes that there might actually be some criminal charges brought by the International Criminal Court, even perhaps by the end of this year. And so I think that's something that would feel really meaningful to Afghan women's rights activists if they actually saw Taliban leaders being charged with crimes because of these acts, like denying girls access to education, denying women access to work, and torturing protesters.
Now it's our last question. You've mentioned the women rights defenders and women's rights activists in Afghanistan, and we've just seen Mehbooba Siraj, who's a senior civil society leader in Afghanistan, and one of the few people to have who've remained in the country. Although there are many who have become activists and who are resisting in the country, asking Taliban to let the girls go to school. And then you have all of these activists who are resisting in their own way. And what do you have to say about this sheer courage of Afghan activists, women and men, but primarily the women and young girls? One wants to look at it and does look at it with a lot of awe, but at the same time, they are at extreme risk in the country.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, most of the kind of high-profile women's rights activists who were around before the Taliban takeover were forced into exile. But what happened immediately within days was that this kind of new movement began to grow up of younger women, often women from less privileged backgrounds, who came out onto the streets because of the way that the Taliban's policies were affecting their own lives. And you see that their most common chant has been bread, work, freedom, which I think really tells you about how desperate the situation is, how basic their demands are. And we've talked about how brutal the Taliban response to these protests has been, but I think these women keep coming out on the streets because they have so little to lose now. And I really believe that even though we've talked about how poor the international response to the crisis in Afghanistan has been, I think the only reason that we've seen any kind of response is because these protesters have made it impossible for the world to look away completely.
Yes, very well said, because I mean, they're the reason why the country is still in news in a particular way. Otherwise, after the US withdrawal, there is been little interest in Afghanistan generally from the international media perspective, and generally from other sectors as well. Thank you so much, Heather, for very briefly in such a short time explaining the situation and the status of Afghan people to us on this 2-year anniversary of the takeover. And yes, we will also be, like you and the rest of the world, be seeing and waiting to see if the Taliban can actually be held accountable, or if they would be forced into a corner where they might agree to soften up a bit. One can't expect miracles, but maybe there might be some policy change. Let's see. Thank you for watching New Wave Global. Thank you to our guest and to our viewers. Khudafiz.